The central thesis of this video is simple but brutal. What Lewis Hamilton revealed about Kimi Antonelli's return in Miami 2026 not only explains how that pole was made, but why it could mark the beginning of something much bigger. Now tell me, what if I told you that Hamilton saw something on that lap that the rest of the world didn't understand? Because while everyone was talking about the 1 minute and 27.798 seconds, the pole, the difference with Max Verstappen, Hamilton was left with a completely different detail. A detail that completely changes the way you should see that lap. It wasn't the speed. It wasn't the car. It was absolute control at the moment of maximum pressure. And here comes the shocking thing. Because what Hamilton said next made it clear that Antonelli is not learning, he is already executing like a champion. The context in which all this occurs is what really gives weight to Lewis Hamilton's revelation, because we are not talking about a clean, perfect, and predictable classification. We are talking about a completely broken weekend for Kimi Antonelli from the beginning. And this is where the story that many did not see begins to be built. Antonelli arrives at Miami 2026 without full control of his car, with problems carried over from the previous sessions, without clear references with the soft tire, and most importantly, without that dominant rhythm that normally anticipates a pole position. In fact, if you analyze his progression during qualifying, you see a competitive driver, yes, but not necessarily the absolute favorite. In Q1 he sets the best time, in Q2 he remains in the fight, but always with the feeling that there are others like Max Verstappen or Charles Leclerc who have something more in store. And that's right where everything changes. Because when Q3 arrives, when the margin for error disappears and everything comes down to a single lap, Antonelli does something that completely redefines the narrative of the weekend. It doesn't improve a little, it doesn't find a few thousandths. It breaks the reference. He nails a 1 minute and 27.798 seconds that leaves everyone behind with a difference that, in current Formula 1, is almost an anomaly. But this is where what Hamilton understood and the rest did not come in. Because it's not just about time. It's all about how you build it. Hamilton detects something that normally only elite drivers can see. Antonelli is not reacting to the track, he is anticipating it. Each sector is assembled with a precision that does not correspond to someone in the development phase. There are no visible corrections, there is no overdriving, there is no that typical excess of aggressiveness that usually appears in young talents when they seek the limit. What there is fluidity, control, decision. And that, on a circuit like Miami, where the slow areas require perfect traction and the straights punish any previous error, is what makes the real difference. In addition, there is another key point that reinforces all this: the context of the car. Mercedes did not arrive as the clear absolute dominator that weekend. That means that this difference cannot be explained solely by mechanical performance. There is a very big part that comes from the pilot, and Hamilton knows it. That is why his words are not coincidental. Because when he says that Antonelli doesn't need anything changed, what he is really saying is that he has already reached that point where the driver does not adapt to the car, but rather imposes his way of driving on it. And this is where Act 1 becomes key to understanding what comes next. Because what we saw in Miami is not just a spectacular pole. It's a sign. A clue that Antonelli is not following the normal path of evolution. It's speeding up that process. You are skipping stages. And when that happens in Formula 1, the impact is not gradual. The breaking point of this whole story is not in the lap itself. It is in what happens immediately afterwards, when Lewis Hamilton decides to analyze what he has just seen and leaves a reading that completely changes the dimension of what happened with Kimi Antonelli. Because here we are no longer talking about execution. We are talking about interpretation. Hamilton does not remain on the surface. It doesn't talk about sectors, it doesn't talk about tires, it doesn't talk about track conditions. He goes straight to what really matters in top-level Formula 1, the ability to put absolutely everything together at the exact right moment. And when he says it, he does it with a clarity that impacts the paddock because he recognizes that what Antonelli did is something that normally takes years to develop, and he is doing it now. And this is where the narrative gets much deeper. Because if we connect this with Antonelli's behavior during that Q3, we find the detail that changes everything. After marking that lap, he makes a small mistake on his second attempt and lifts his foot. He doesn't insist, does not overdrive. He doesn't go into that desperate mode that we have seen even in world champions when they smell the opportunity to improve. He simply decides that enough is enough. And that decision is what really shocks Hamilton. Because that's not pure talent. That is total understanding of the moment. It's knowing exactly where you are, what you've done, and how much you need to risk. It is, in essence, the mentality of a consolidated champion, in a driver who is still beginning his story. Furthermore, this point connects directly with something that is critical in modern Formula 1. risk management. In an era where margins are minimal and every mistake pays dearly, the difference between a great driver and a future dominator is knowing when to push and when not to. And Antonelli shows that he already has that balance. That's why Hamilton insists so much that nothing needs to be changed. Because what you are seeing is not just speed. You're looking at mental structure. You're looking at a driver who doesn't depend on the perfect context to perform, who can build a historic lap even when everything around him isn't aligned. And that is exactly what defines the drivers who end up marking eras. And here comes another factor that amplifies all this: the direct comparison with the rest of the grid. While drivers like Max Verstappen or Charles Leclerc squeeze each attempt to the limit, looking for those final thousandths, Antonelli had already done the job on his first attempt. That's not only efficiency, it's superiority in reading the moment. And Hamilton senses it because he's been there. He has experienced those turns where everything aligns, where you know you don't need more, where any further attempt is more risk than benefit. And recognizing that in another driver, especially someone so young, is what causes such an emotional reaction. Because at that moment, Hamilton is not seeing a brilliant rookie. You're looking at someone who already understands the game at the highest level. And that's what really shocks everyone. Because if Antonelli can do this now, the question stops being if he is going to win. And this is where everything converges. Because what started as an impressive lap in Miami 2026 ends up becoming a direct warning for the entire Formula One. What Lewis Hamilton reveals is not simply admiration. It is recognition of a pattern he's seen before. Because every dominant era in this sport begins exactly like this, with performances that seem isolated, but are actually the first symptom of something much bigger. And Kimi Antonelli fits that mold perfectly. Because if we analyze everything that happened in Miami, we understand that it was not a specific combination of factors. It wasn't luck. It was not a clearly superior car. He was a driver who, even in imperfect conditions, was able to set a lap that no one else could replicate. And here is the final key. When a driver achieves that level of execution without having complete control of the weekend, it means that his real ceiling is still much higher. And that's what really leaves the paddock uneasy. Because now everyone understands that this is not Antonelli's limit. It's just the beginning. Hamilton perceives it before anyone else because he knows how dynasties are built in Formula One. He knows that they don't start with total dominance from the first moment. They start with flashes like this, where a driver shows that he can do something that the rest simply cannot match, even when the conditions are not ideal. And if you add experience, car development, team evolution, the result is inevitable. That's why his words carry so much weight. Because he is not talking about the present, he is anticipating the future. A future where names like Max Verstappen or Charles Leclerc no longer only compete with each other, but have to face someone who arrived at that level before their time. And this is where the video closes with the most important question of all. If Antonelli can already do this at 19 years old, with a car that was not perfect and on a complicated weekend, what will happen when everything is on your side? Because if what we saw in Miami was a sign, then Formula One could be about to enter a new era. And in the end, everything comes back to the same point. It's not the pole. It is not 1 minute and 27.798 seconds. It's not even the difference over Max Verstappen or Charles Leclerc. It's what Lewis Hamilton saw and decided to say. Because when a driver like Hamilton, with everything he has experienced in this sport, stops to highlight something so specific, he does not do it out of the emotion of the moment. He does it because he recognizes something that cannot be taught, something that cannot be manufactured with experience. Absolute control under pressure. And that is exactly what Kimi Antonelli showed at Miami 2026. A round built without visible errors, a cold decision not to risk more on the second attempt, an execution that does not correspond to someone who should still be learning, but to someone who already understands the game at its highest level. That's why this story doesn't end in Miami. This is where it really starts. Because what Hamilton revealed was not just an opinion, it was a signal to the entire paddock. A sign that Antonelli is not following the usual path. It is advancing stages. It is reaching ahead of time to a level that normally takes years to reach. And when that happens in Formula One, the impact is not progressive. It's inevitable. So now the final question is not whether Antonelli is going to do a lap like that again. The real question is, how many more times are we about to see something like this before we realize that it is already the new benchmark? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.